we're getting straight into objects. And what those are, they are very simply, as they come from object-oriented programming, they are a container. They're the pinnacle. They are the container of data and methods. That is honestly the simplest way that I could think of to explain. And the way you represent that data and methods is very simply through key and value pairs. And I'll explain what that means in a second. But let me just show you, right? So we can see objects, there are multiple objects, and they contain data represented by the X right here. And then they contain methods or functions represented by the effects and the very nice orange circle right here. Now let's get into how we create one. So let's say, for example, you want to create an object that is a user, right? Think of it as a user, as you're a user, for example, of Google.com or something like that. So I'm going to say user, and to create a object with user, you simply use the bracket notation like so, right? And with that, we get into creating properties. Now remember, I said a container of data, and the way you represent that data or methods is through key value pairs. And so let me tell you what a key is. So a key is simply a string that represents a property, right? So for example, in our case, we're going to say first name. And the first name will be John, just because that's the first thing that came to my head. And that, my friends, is a key value pair. Key first name, value is John. So a key is always a string, and a value can really be anything that you want, right? First name is a string. For example, if you look at the property, you see this property, first name is a string. It's just that we're not putting it into like this. You don't have to do it for objects, only sometimes, and I will show why or how. Let's say we do last name as well, right? And let's say John has a cool name called Davis, and that's his last name, right? And so that, my friends, is an object. We have created ourselves an object like that. And so let's go ahead and print this out, console log user, like that, and we're going to here, and this right here is an object. You see, right, even right here it says object. Now what we can also do, we can also even add functions to objects. So let's say, for example, this user has a password, right? So we go ahead and we say set password equals set password, like so, and that is a function itself. And we do, remember how we had that fancy new way of creating functions, and we put it, and the parameter for this is password. That's one of the parameters we're going to pass in, and we're gonna say, and we have to pass in the user as well. And I'll explain why. So you have to pass in an instance of a user, and then you have to pass in the password. And so what we're going to do then is we're gonna say user.password equals password. That's just an example. You can also create a function, let's say get full name. That's actually used a lot. So if we say get full name, that just looks like this. We can do, for example, return, and we can use our fancy template literals. We can do like that, and we do user dot first name space user dot last name, and that returns a full name, right? So that you can put in functions. You can literally, the value can literally be anything. It can be a dog, it can be a cat. Well, maybe not a dog or a cat, but it can literally be anything that you want as a value. So let's go ahead and I would like for us to take a look at and how we actually, for example, use those functions. So let's say we have console log.user, right? And we do, now we do console log, right? Console log, and we say user dot get full name, and we're going to pass in the user. And the reason we're passing the user is, again, because we have to have a way to access it. So that's why we're passing a user, okay? So we do get full name, and if we, right here, John Davis, right? Just like that. Now let's say we want to access a property. So let's say you want to access first name or last name. So we could just do user, so we do console log user dot first name if you want to access a certain property. And that will access a certain property, like through it. It's called, we call it through a dot notation. So you access it through a dot notation. So that's one way to access it. There's also another way to access it, right? That you can also access it through a bracket notation. So for example, if I do console log user and I do bracket just like so, and now I say last name, that works as well. Now, when would you use bracket dot notation versus bracket notation? Well, in some cases, a lot of the times you would actually use this to make sure that it works with everything, because this works every time, and you can actually put in variables in here. So if there's a certain variable that's a string, you can put that in there. But let's say, for example, we say, we have user hobbies, right? User hobbies. And that's, for example, that's just a list of soccer, volleyball, and so forth. Well, you can see right away that we're getting an error. And the reason why there's an error is because we cannot have a space as a key, right? So that means then it can't map out to a string. So in that case, what you have to do is you have to do string just like that. And now it is all good, and it will properly map to this key will properly map to this value as an array. Right. Now you might be asking, okay, well, how do we go ahead and we console log it? Well, let's try it out. So if I go ahead and if I do console log user hobbies, what do you think will happen? I think something crazy will happen. You can see missing after argument list, something's not right. It doesn't know what the heck this is, right? And so that is where the bracket notation actually comes in. The bracket notation comes in because you can now put in a string just like so. What? Hold on. Un momento, por favor. Sometimes I speak Spanish. And now we have the hobbies. Not a problem. And so that, my friends, is when you would use bracket notation versus dot notation. And we're going to see that as we get along into further projects. Now, let's look into how, for example, do we check for if a certain property exists on this object, right? So if I go ahead and let's go ahead and comment this part out just for now. And I go ahead and let's check if there's a first name property in here. So I'm going to say if, and I say first name in user, then console log first. See, sometimes I can't type. That's okay. We all have to learn. First name exists. Perfect. So let's try that out. I'm gonna refresh this. First name exists. Now let's try something else. Now I'm just gonna copy this part and paste it into here. Now let's say if random attribute in user console log random attribute exists, else we're gonna say console log random attribute does not exist. Attribute does not exist. And now we refresh. Random attribute does not exist. And that, my friends, is how you check if an attribute does exist. For example, if a key does exist or if a key does not exist in an object. And we tend to use that a lot, honestly. We tend to use this functionality a lot. Okay, moving on, let's look into how do we loop through this, right? So before we've looped through arrays, which was obviously, that was fun. Now let's look into how we loop through an object like so. It's gonna be just like, I'm gonna comment this part out. And the way you loop through it, remember we had a for loop. So if we say for let property, I'm gonna say property of user, we're gonna say console log like that. See what happens. Oh, no, looks like it's not working. So user is not iterable, and that makes sense because user is an object. It's not a list. It's really hard you can't really iterate through it. Instead, what we do is we do let property. We use something for in, which is going to loop through the keys of the object. So if we say property, and if we do this now, right now we have all the keys of the certain object. And now what we can do is we can simply do user like this prop. And this is again where the bracket notation comes in, you see, because we cannot just say user.prop. That's not gonna work. If we do this, it's going to search for user.prop, and prop is nowhere here to be found. Instead, what we need to do is we need to pass it into a bracket notation, because bracket notation specifically says, hey, you need to find a key that has a certain variable, a certain string that's a variable in this case prop, which replaces it with a string right there. John Davis function list, and then user function, another function that we got. So both of those are working. And so that, my friends, is an object. And the last thing I want to, before we leave, the last thing I want to show you is there's actually two ways to create an object. You can see, we can create an object using bracket notation. We can also create an object simply by doing new object, just like that. And you just pass in an object, and that's pretty much it. The same thing is nothing really. Oops, I did not type that right. Again, see, I'm still learning, guys. I'm still learning how to type. I'm kidding. I'm not learning how to type. I'm a pretty good typer most of the time. Refresh that. So you can see, right, that it's just exactly the same outcome. Nothing really changes. It's just it's more work. So why put that in? And so most of the time we don't really put that part in here. Yeah. And so that, my friends, is objects, and that's how we use objects in JavaScript.